Let me start by telling you something most people don't want to hear. Motivation is not coming to save you. Some days you wake up fired up, focused, ready to conquer the world. And other days, you feel tired, distracted, unmotivated, and stuck. And too many people decide the quality of their life based on which kind of day it is. Here's the truth. If you wait to feel motivated, you will wait forever. The people who win in life, the people who grow, lead, and achieve at a higher level are not more motivated than you. They're more disciplined. They've learned how to move forward even when the energy is low, the emotions are heavy, and the excuses feel convincing. Discipline is not about being extreme. It's about deciding in advance about who you are and how you show up, especially on the days you don't feel like it. Because here's the shift that changes everything. You don't need motivation to take action. You need action to create motivation. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a small one, you build trust with yourself. And that trust becomes confidence. That confidence becomes momentum. And that momentum changes your life. So today, we're not talking about hype. We're talking about standards. We're talking about identity. We're talking about how to build discipline when motivation is gone and how that discipline becomes your unfair advantage. Let's get into it. Motivation feels amazing when it's there. It feels like clarity, like energy, like confidence all rolled into one. When motivation hits, you wake up early, you plan your day, and you feel unstoppable. You tell yourself, this time I'm serious. And for a moment, you believe that feeling will last, but it never does. Motivation is emotional. It's chemical. It's situational. It depends on how well you slept, what someone said to you, whether things are going your way, and whether the results are showing up yet. And the moment life pushes back, motivation fades. That's not a weakness. That's human biology. The problem isn't that motivation disappears. The problem is that most people build their entire life strategy around it. They tell themselves, I'll start when I feel motivated. I'll stay consistent when I feel inspired. I'll work hard when I'm in the right mood. But moods change. Energy fluctuates. Emotions rise and fall. And if your progress depends on motivation, your progress will always be inconsistent. Think about how many goals fail not because people didn't know what to do, but because they waited to feel like doing it. The gym membership that went unused, the business idea that stayed an idea, the book that never got written, not because of lack of talent, but because motivation stopped showing up. High performers understand something most people never learn. Motivation is a visitor, not a foundation. You can't build a life on something that comes and goes. Motivation spikes when something is new, when there's excitement, when there's novelty. But the moment repetition enters the picture, motivation leaves. And success is repetitive. Growth is repetitive. Discipline is repetitive. No one talks about that part. We celebrate the highlight moments, but we ignore the thousands of ordinary, unexciting actions that actually create progress. Motivation doesn't survive in ordinary moments. It fades the second things become difficult, boring, or uncomfortable. That's why relying on motivation is dangerous. It trains you to quit the moment things don't feel good. And here's the part that really matters. Waiting for motivation puts your life on pause. Every day you say, I'll start when I feel motivated. You are outsourcing your future to a feeling you don't control. You're giving your power away to emotion. You're letting circumstances decide your standards. High performers don't do that. They don't ask, do I feel motivated today? They ask because motivation asks for perfect conditions. Discipline works in imperfect ones. Motivation wants energy first, results later. Discipline says, show up first, energy follows. Most people get that backwards. They wait to feel ready before they act. But readiness is a myth. Confidence doesn't come before action. Clarity doesn't come before action. Motivation doesn't come before action. Action comes first. Motivation is often the reward, not the requirement. If you look closely at moments when you felt motivated in the past, you'll notice something important. Motivation usually came after progress, after a small win, after movement, after the effort, rarely before. But when you don't understand that, you start believing something is wrong with you when motivation disappears. You think you're lazy. You think you lack willpower. You think others have something you don't. They don't. They just stopped trusting motivation. They stopped waiting for it to arrive. They stopped negotiating with their emotions. They stopped asking permission for how they felt. They decided that feelings don't get a vote in commitments. Motivation is great when it shows up. Enjoy it when it does. Use it when it's there, but never depend on, never assume it will stay. Never confuse excitement with reliability, because the truth is motivation doesn't stick around when things get uncomfortable, and every meaningful goal eventually becomes uncomfortable. Progress demands consistency. Consistency demands action, and action cannot depend on motivation if you want results that last. When motivation fades, most people slow down. High performers lean on structure. They lean on routines. They lean on decisions made in advance. They lean on identity. They understand that motivation is temporary, but standards are stable. They stop saying, I don't feel like it, and start saying, hey, this is what I do. And once you internalize that motivation is unreliable, not as a negative, but as a fact, you stop waiting. You stop delaying. You stop being surprised when resistance shows up. You expect it. You plan for it. You anyway. And that shift alone changes how you approach everything, your goals, your habits, your work, your life. Because now motivation is no longer the driver. It's just a bonus when it shows up. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline is something you feel. They think it shows up as willpower, as energy, as motivation's tougher cousin. They believe disciplined people wake up wanting to do the hard things, wanting to push, wanting to sacrifice, wanting to stay consistent. That's not how it works. Discipline is not a feeling, it's a decision. And that decision is often made when you don't feel ready, don't feel confident, don't feel motivated, and don't feel strong. In fact, discipline usually shows up in direct opposition to how you feel. Feelings say rest. Discipline says do what you said you would do. Feelings say skip today. Discipline says show up anyway. Feelings ask for comfort. Discipline asks for commitment. The mistake most people make is waiting for discipline to feel natural. They wait for it to feel easy. They wait for it to feel aligned. But discipline doesn't feel good in the moment. It feels uncomfortable. It feels inconvenient. It feels heavy. And that's why so few people practice it, because they're trying to feel their way into discipline instead of deciding their way into it. High performers understand this early. Discipline is not something you summon. It's something you choose. You choose it in advance. You choose it before emotions get involved. You choose it before excuses start negotiating. The strongest discipline doesn't happen in the moment of action. It happens in the moment of decision. When you decide who you are, when you decide what you stand for, when you decide what your standards are. Because once a decision is made at the identity level, the action becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. Most people live in reaction mode. They wake up and ask, how do I feel today? And then they let that answer determine how they behave. That's emotional leadership. And emotional leadership creates inconsistent lives. Discipline flips that script. Discipline says, this is who I am, regardless of how I feel. It removes debate. You don't debate whether you brush your teeth. You don't debate whether you show up to certain responsibilities. You don't debate things that are part of your identity. That's the level discipline operates at. It's not about force. It's about clarity. Undisciplined lives are full of decision fatigue, constant negotiation, constant internal arguments. Should I? Maybe later. Just this once. And that mental friction drains energy faster than the work itself. Discipline simplifies life. When the decision is already made, action requires less emotional effort. You're not fighting yourself. You're following through. And here's the truth most people avoid. Discipline is uncomfortable because it requires self-leadership. It requires you to act without applause, to show up without validation, to keep promises when no one is watching. That's why discipline builds self-respect. Every time you follow through on a decision, especially when you don't feel like it, you send a message to yourself, I can trust myself. And trust is everything. People who lack discipline often don't lack ability. They lack trust in themselves. They've broken too many promises. They've negotiated too often. So when things get hard, they don't believe they'll follow through anyway. Discipline repairs that one decision at a time. One kept promise at a time. Not big, dramatic changes. Small, deliberate decisions are honored consistently. And notice this discipline doesn't ask for intensity. It asks for consistency. You don't need to go all in. You need to go again. Most people burn out because they rely on intensity instead of discipline. They go hard for a week, then disappear for a month. Discipline doesn't spike. It stabilizes. It turns progress into something boring, repeatable, and reliable. That's why discipline doesn't look impressive in the moment. It looks ordinary. It looks like showing up when no one is clapping. It looks like doing the basics well again and again. But over time, those decisions compound. And here's another important shift. Discipline is not about control. It's about freedom. That sounds backwards to people who resist it. They think discipline limits them. That takes away choice. That makes life rigid. In reality, discipline removes chaos. When you don't decide, life decides for you. When you don't choose structure, distraction fills the space. When you don't set standards, circumstances set them for you. Discipline gives you back control over your direction. It frees you from constantly reacting. It frees you from emotional roller coasters. It frees you from starting over again and again. And the more disciplined you become, the less discipline you actually need because habits take over. Decisions repeated long enough turn into automatic behavior. At that point, discipline stops feeling heavy and starts feeling normal. But it always begins the same way with a choice. Not a feeling, not a mood, not a burst of motivation. A decision, a quiet one, a firm one. One that doesn't need permission from emotion because discipline doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It creates progress in imperfect ones. And every time you decide to act without feeling like it, you strengthen that muscle. You reinforce that identity. You make discipline less about effort and more about who you are becoming, not someday. Not when things are easier, not when motivation returns. High performers don't wait to feel ready. That alone separates them from everyone else. They don't wake up every day feeling confident. They don't feel inspired all the time. They don't feel powerful, focused, or driven every morning. They feel tired. They feel distracted. They feel uncertain. Just like everyone else. The difference is simple but uncomfortable. They act anyway. Most people believe action should follow emotion, that you should feel confident before you act, feel motivated before you commit, feel clear before you move forward. And when those feelings don't show up, they hesitate, they delay, they wait. High performers reverse the order. They understand that action comes first, not as a reward for feeling good, but as a requirement for progress. They don't ask, do I feel like doing this today? They ask, what does this moment require of me? That shift changes everything. Because feelings are unpredictable, they change based on sleep, stress, mood, environment, and feedback. If action depends on feelings, consistency becomes impossible. High performers don't ignore how they feel. They just don't let feelings make decisions. They know something most people resist accepting, waiting to feel like it is the fastest way to stay stuck. Think about how many times people say, I'll start when I feel more confident. But confidence doesn't come from thinking about action. It comes from taking it. Every confident person you admire became confident by acting while they were unsure. Action is not the result of confidence. Confidence is the result of action. High performers understand this loop. That's why they move early. That's why they don't overthink. That's why they don't need perfect conditions. They act when it's uncomfortable. They act when it's inconvenient. They act when they'd rather do something easier. And they don't romanticize it. They don't pretend it feels good. They don't pretend they love the grind. They simply accept that progress has a cost, and they're willing to pay it. Most people confuse comfort with intuition. They think resistance means something is wrong. High performers know resistance usually means something matters. Growth always creates friction. If you wait for comfort, you delay growth. If you wait for certainty, you delay progress. If you wait to feel like it, you delay your life. High performers act because they've trained themselves to respect commitments more than comfort. They understand that feelings are temporary, but the cost of inaction is permanent. Every time you avoid action because you don't feel like it, you reinforce hesitation. You teach yourself that discomfort is a stop sign, and over time, that pattern becomes identity. High performers break that pattern early. They don't build discipline through massive acts of willpower. They build it through small moments of follow through choosing action in moments when no one would blame them for quitting. Those moments shape identity. Every time they act without feeling like it, they send themselves a signal, I move even when it's hard, and that signal compounds because action builds momentum. Momentum reduces resistance. Resistance fades with repetition, but you never get there if you wait for emotions to cooperate. High performers understand that emotions catch up later. They know that energy often arrives after you start. That clarity shows up after movement. That motivation follows progress. Most people sit still waiting to feel something. High performers move first and let feelings catch up. That's why they look disciplined from the outside. That's why they look consistent, not because they're stronger, but because they stopped negotiating with how they feel. They stopped asking permission. They treat action as non-negotiable. And here's something important: acting when you don't feel like it doesn't mean pushing yourself to exhaustion. It doesn't mean ignoring health or rest. It means honoring priorities even when enthusiasm is low. It means doing the minimum required to maintain momentum instead of quitting entirely. High performers don't rely on all or nothing behavior. They understand that something done imperfectly beats nothing done perfectly. They show up at 60% instead of disappearing. They move forward slowly instead of stopping. They stay in motion because motion changes state. Stillness amplifies doubt. Movement dissolves it. High performers also know that feelings lie. Fear exaggerates risk. Resistance exaggerates effort. Discomfort exaggerates difficulty. If you obey those feelings, they grow stronger. If you act despite them, they lose power. Action is how you retrain your nervous system. It teaches your brain that discomfort is survivable, that effort is manageable. That progress is possible. That's why action builds courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's movement in the presence of it. And high performers don't wait for fear to disappear. They move with it. They understand that waiting for the perfect internal state is unrealistic. Life doesn't pause until you feel aligned. Opportunities don't wait until you're confident. Time keeps moving. So they move too. They act on principles instead of moods. They act on standards instead of emotions. They act on identity instead of impulse. And over time, that behavior rewires them. Acting when you don't feel like it becomes normal. Resistance becomes familiar. And what once felt heavy starts to feel expected. Not easy, expected. And expected resistance stops being a barrier, because once you accept that you won't always feel like it, the excuse disappears. The waiting ends. The delay loses its justification. You stop asking, do I feel like it? And start asking, what's the next action? That question moves you forward every time. Not because it feels good, not because it feels natural, but because action is the standard, and standards don't wait for feelings. Most people try to change their behavior without ever changing how they see themselves. They focus on tactics, on tools, on hacks, on motivation. They say, I need better habits. I need more discipline. I need to be more consistent. But underneath all of that is a deeper issue they rarely address. They haven't decided who they are, because discipline doesn't come from effort alone. It comes from identity. It comes from standards. It comes from a clear answer to one question. What kind of person am I? If you don't answer that question intentionally, life will answer it for you through patterns, excuses, and repeated choices. High performers don't rely on discipline as a force. They rely on identity as guidance. They don't say, I'm trying to work out more. They say, I'm someone who trains. They don't say, I'm trying to be focused. They say, I'm someone who honors my priorities. That language matters, because behavior follows identity. When something is part of who you are, it stops being optional. You don't debate it. You don't negotiate it. You don't wait to feel like it. You simply act in alignment with it. Most people live with vague identities. I'm trying. I hope. I want. Those identities produce inconsistent actions. High performers live with defined identities, clear standards, non-negotiables, and standards are what turn identity into action. A standard is a line you don't cross, a rule you don't debate, a minimum level of behavior you agree to uphold regardless of mood or circumstance. Without standards, identity stays theoretical. You can believe you're disciplined, but if there's no standard for how you show up when things are hard, discipline disappears the moment resistance appears. Standards remove choice. That's why they're powerful. Most people think freedom comes from having options. High performers know freedom comes from eliminating the wrong ones. When you set a standard, you reduce decision fatigue. You stop asking, should I? And start saying, this is what I do. And the clearer the standard, the less discipline it requires. Ambiguity drains energy. Clarity conserves it. People without standards rely on willpower. People with standards rely on structure. And structure wins. Here's where most people get stuck. They set goals, not standards. Goals are outcomes you hope to reach someday. Standards are behaviors you live by today. Goals are future-focused. Standards are present-focused. Goals inspire. Standards regulate. You don't need discipline to dream. You need discipline to live. High performers don't obsess over distant outcomes. They obsess over daily standards. How they show up. How do they speak to themselves? How they manage their energy? How they respond when it's inconvenient? Those standards shape identity over time, and identity shapes discipline automatically. If your identity is unclear, discipline feels forced. If your identity is solid, discipline feels aligned. That's why borrowed motivation never lasts. You can feel inspired by someone else's energy for a moment, but if it doesn't match who you believe you are, it fades. Discipline that sticks is personal. It's rooted in values, in self-respect, in a decision about the kind of life you're building. High performers don't ask, what do I feel like doing today? They ask, what does someone like me do in this situation? That question bypasses emotion. It anchors action to identity instead of mood. And here's the important part. Identity is not something you discover. It's something you practice. You don't wait until you feel like a disciplined person to act disciplined. You act disciplined until it becomes who you are. Identity is built through evidence. Every action is a vote. Every follow-through is proof. Every standard upheld reinforces belief. Most people let exceptions define them. High performers let standards define them. They understand that lowering standards is easier than raising them, but it comes at a cost. Every time you break a standard, you don't just break a habit. You weaken trust with yourself. You send a signal that your word is flexible. High performers protect that trust aggressively, not because they're perfect, but because they're intentional. They don't need extreme standards. They need consistent ones. Discipline fails when standards are unrealistic. When identity is built on pressure instead of principle, high performers know the difference. Their standards are challenging but sustainable, clear but human, firm but flexible where it matters. They don't ask for perfection. They ask for integrity. Integrity is alignment between who you say you are and how you act when it's inconvenient. That alignment creates internal strength. And once identity and standards are aligned, discipline stops feeling like resistance. It becomes self-expression. You're not forcing yourself to act. You're being yourself. That's the shift most people miss. They think discipline is about controlling behavior. It's not. It's about defining identity. When identity is weak, discipline collapses under pressure. When identity is strong, discipline survives discomfort. And that strength doesn't come from hype. It comes from repetition, from showing up as the same person on good days and bad days, from honoring standards even when no one sees it, from making decisions that reinforce who you are becoming. Because in the end, discipline isn't about doing more. It's about becoming someone who does what they say they will do, and that begins with identity. Most people believe motivation is the engine. They think once they feel inspired enough, energized enough, confident enough, everything will suddenly start moving. They wait for that internal spark, that emotional push, that moment where action feels easy. But that moment is rare, and when it does show up, it never stays. Momentum doesn't begin with motivation. Momentum begins with action. This is where most people get stuck. They sit still waiting to feel something, not realizing that stillness is exactly what keeps them feeling stuck. Lack of action creates heaviness. It creates doubt. It creates confusion. And then people mistake that state for a lack of motivation. But what they're really lacking is movement. Action changes your state. It shifts your focus. It redirects your energy. It sends a signal to your brain that progress is happening. And once progress starts, even at the smallest level, momentum begins to build. Momentum is emotional evidence. When you take action, your brain gets proof that you are capable, that movement is possible, that effort leads somewhere. That proof generates energy. That energy feels like motivation. But it didn't come first, it came second. Most people have the order backwards. They want to feel motivated so they can act. High performers act so that motivation can follow. That's why starting is always the hardest part. Not because the task is impossible, but because momentum hasn't kicked in yet. Once you're in motion, resistance drops. What felt heavy begins to feel manageable. What felt overwhelming becomes clearer. But you only get there by moving. Action doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be complete. It just needs to exist. A small action breaks inertia. A small win shifts belief. A small step creates direction. And direction is powerful. Stagnation amplifies doubt. Movement dissolves it. When you're not taking action, your mind fills the gap with stories. Stories about why it won't work. Why are you behind? Why you're not ready? Those stories feel convincing because there's no counter evidence. Action interrupts those stories. The moment you move, your attention shifts outward. You're no longer trapped in analysis. You're engaged, you're responding, you're learning. Momentum doesn't come from thinking your way forward. It comes from doing your way forward. High performers understand this deeply. That's why they don't wait to have the perfect plan. They don't wait to feel certain. They don't wait to feel fearless. They take the next obvious action, then the next, then the next. And with each step, momentum builds. Not because the work gets easier, but because belief gets stronger. Momentum feeds confidence. Confidence feeds courage. Courage feeds consistency. But it all starts with action. Most people overestimate the amount of motivation required and underestimate the power of momentum. They think they need to feel ready. But readiness is created through repetition, not emotion. You become ready by showing up. You become capable by practicing. You become confident by doing. Action creates feedback. Feedback creates adjustment. Adjustment creates progress. Without action, there is no feedback. Without feedback, there is no growth. Without growth, motivation fades because nothing is reinforcing it. High performers don't rely on motivation to carry them forward. They rely on systems that keep them in motion. They know that once momentum exists, discipline feels lighter. Effort feels purposeful. Resistance becomes something to work through instead of something to fear. Momentum doesn't eliminate discomfort. It makes discomfort feel worth it. That's why consistency matters more than intensity. One intense burst of motivation doesn't build momentum. Repeated action does. Momentum is cumulative. It's built by small actions done consistently, not by big actions done occasionally. That's also why stopping is so dangerous. When you stop completely, momentum decays. Getting started again feels heavy because you're pushing against inertia all over again. High performers protect momentum fiercely. They don't disappear when things get hard. They reduce the scope instead of quitting. They keep some form of movement alive because they understand that momentum is fragile at the beginning and powerful once established. They don't need to feel inspired every day. They just need to keep moving. And here's the key: shift action doesn't just change what you do. It changes how you think. When you act, your identity shifts. You start seeing yourself as someone who moves, someone who tries, someone who follows through. That identity reinforces future action. Inaction creates an identity of hesitation. Action creates an identity of momentum. And identity drives behavior. This is why waiting for motivation is so costly. Every day you wait, you reinforce stillness. You reinforce delay. You reinforce the belief that you need permission from emotion before you move. Action removes that permission slip. It says, I move because I choose to, not because I feel like it. That choice is powerful because once you experience momentum, even briefly, you stop romanticizing motivation. You stop chasing hype. You stop waiting for the perfect internal state. You start respecting progress instead. You learn that motivation is not something you summon. It's something you earn through action. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop asking, how do I get motivated? And start asking, what's the smallest action I can take right now? That question creates movement. Movement creates momentum. Momentum changes behavior. And behavior changes lives. If there's one thing you take from this, let it be this: you don't need to feel ready to move forward. You don't need to feel motivated to begin. You don't need to feel confident to take the next step. You need to decide who you are. Decide what your standards are. Decide that action is no longer optional. Because every time you choose action over excuses, discipline over comfort, and standards over feelings, you become stronger. Not someday, not gradually, immediately. Your life doesn't change when motivation shows up. Your life changes when you show up. So don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait for the perfect feeling. Don't wait for motivation to come back. Take action now. And if this message spoke to you, don't just listen. Apply it. Choose one small action today and commit to it. Think less. Act now.